Okay, I think I should probably start opening this up for questions if we want to have enough time. Does anybody have a question right back here?
Yes, I don't know if this is just too obvious, but could everybody just speak a little bit about why fantasy matters to you?
Okay, the question is just kind of, let's roll back to our premise, why fantasy matters to any of the people on the panel.
I have to say, you know, it's interesting because generally these days I'm not interested in something unless it has a fantastical element. I'm not interested in television or movie or, you know, unless it feels like it has that sort of element to it. And I think the key for me is a sense of wonder, a sense of something that I don't expect might happen at any moment, a sense that I haven't been told all the rules of the universe that I'm in, and I'm getting to discover them. And that allows me to engage with the text, with the work of fiction that I'm enjoying at the time, in a more active way. That I don't feel like I'm just receiving a story, that I feel like I'm actually, I'm the explorer, you know, forging through a new land, and I find that really compelling to me personally.
Yes. You know, I feel as if, you know, if something matters to you a great deal, it's often very hard to explain why it matters. So I'm probably going to agree with what everybody up here is saying, but, you know, I feel as if it's so important on some level to the way that I need to relook at things that I can't actually explain why it is that it matters to me. It's very, very important.
I think a lot about the fact that for most of the history of literature that we know about, most literature was fantasy. I mean, up through Shakespeare, it was not looked askance upon to have witches and magic and spirits in your stuff. And so the more time I spend reading and writing fantasy, the more perverse it seems to me, this idea that fiction has to pretend to act like the real world and obey the laws of thermodynamics and all that stuff.
Although just to interject, I mean, at the time though, didn't they believe witches were real, right? So you could say Shakespeare was trying to write realist.
I guess that's true.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, probably, I do think that, you know, our society has certainly become much more, that we just sort of feel like we know, we can describe the world in much more mathematical terms these days, and scientific terms, and we're all trained in that to some extent, to think that we know reality and what really can and can't happen. Mm-hmm. More than I suspect people did before, certainly before science education became mainstream, right? So,
yeah, there's this total conviction that we understand the world, which probably didn't exist before. Well, my point sort of died. It's so empowering as a writer to be able to reshape reality rather than mimic it. That I find myself saying, well, why does realism matter? I find myself asking that question much more often.
You know, when you first asked the question, my answer was going to be something to do like, it's fun, I enjoy it, does it have to matter? But actually, no, I mean, what you said, it really does resonate with me, the idea that the emphasis on perfect scientific knowledge of the world, the rational understanding of the world. I mean, there is something very powerful and appealing about a deliberately irrational, impossible book, whatever, something that's satisfying, and I think emotionally valuable about something which is deliberately not rational, not fully understood. Which, you know, doesn't necessarily have to fit into all the tropes of the fantasy genre, but fantasy is a form of sticking a figure up at the completely rational understanding of the world and the delusion of realism being able to encompass the world.
Okay, how about you in the front row?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about world building that we're doing in fantasy. I'm wondering how often for you guys the world comes first, and how often the stories of characters comes first, or how they work together when you have your original ideas.
I'm going to repeat that so that everyone in the back can hear it. The question is, we've talked about world building. To what extent, when writing, does the world come first or the story?
For me, it's always the characters in the story. And then, of course, it's sort of like chicken or egg. If I don't care about the characters, I don't even sit down to write. And then once I sort of feel like I have the characters, the world kind of shapes around them a little bit, and then the world sort of like races off in all directions. And I feel like at that point, I sort of come to an understanding of my own world, of the world, which I find important for giving my characters constraints to play in. There are people who can do, I think, amazing work in universes that don't have certain kinds of rules, that don't have clear rules. For me, I actually find it freeing, and as a writer, to have constraints on what my characters can accomplish within their universe, not just sort of set up in a way that I make rules for myself, essentially, that I don't let myself break, unless I can figure out a way around them. And I find that fruitful for myself.
I really enjoy other people's world building.
I'll just, Naomi gave my answer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that either. I start with sort of bits and pieces of this idea and this image and this character and this thing that would be cool in the setting, or some point I want to make in a sort of sideways way, and then I sort of bodge them together and throw away the bits that don't fit, and then it's this endlessly sort of going back and realizing that the story doesn't work unless you change this detail in the world, and then you change that, you need to change that about the character, and then finally at some point your editor says you have to stop doing this now.
Okay, in the yellow?
Yes. I wanted to get your opinion on this opinion of Margaret Atwood. She believes that fantasy arose out of science fiction, and I strongly disagree with that assessment. For some reasons, actually, that you, Lev Grossman, had explained a few minutes ago. I'd be interested in your comments on that.
So I missed the crucial part of the question. Restate that with.
Came out of science fiction.
All right.
She means that people were writing science fiction before, like, the modern fantasy novel thing. Like, I don't know. That doesn't really make sense.
I don't know.
Right. I need more context.
Okay. We're gonna move back. You back there. I can see you. No, you. Yes, you.
I'd just like to know briefly, was there a moment in your life when you realized, I'm a fantasy writer? Like,
Did everyone hear that? Moment in their life when they all realized they were a fantasy writer.
I guess, professionally, the day my agent called me and said, that's the actual plot of your book. Yay, I'm a writer.
I realized I was a science fiction writer in the MFA program when I actually began writing ghost stories and fantasy stories, but I will cling to the science fiction title.
I started writing fantasy at a pretty advanced age when I was 35. So old enough to be really self-dramatic about it. And so, yeah, there really was a moment where the first time I wrote a sentence, let's do it this way, let's have this guy cast a spell. I mean, I'm thinking about it right now, it was a real moment, and it was just electric, and I sort of came out to myself. I really didn't know it before then.
Yeah, and I suppose I must have started writing fantasy at the almost equally advanced age of about 32. And yeah, there's a similar sort of, you know, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this, I'm going to sit down and do this. And then you realize that you've written 5 pages and it's undeniable now.
See, for me, it was more like I was 3 and I made my mother make up stories about like Captain Hook's adventures, continuing adventures for me. And then I think when I was 10, I wrote about 100 pages of a really, really, really terrible Mary Sue fantasy something universe. I don't even remember it.
I did that too, but that's children. That's being a child. That's excusable.
Yes.
As an adult,
Yeah, but I never quite stopped.
You'll have to experiment.
Sort of.
So some of you had sort of an interlude where you tried other things, and this was more of a return to that childhood. And some of us just knew it all along. You back there.
I actually wanted to challenge what you guys were saying earlier about science education in America, well, States. I mean, given the fact that there's all of this negativity towards believing in evolution, global warming, vaccines, and stuff like that, I really don't think science education is as concrete as you are making it out to be.
No. I'm sorry. I should clarify. I don't mean that. What I'm, unfortunately, I feel like somebody who, if you're into fantasy to begin with, if you're reading fantasy and science fiction these days, I think that probably, all right, giant horrible generalization here. I think that most people who are fans of science fiction and fantasy are at least interested in engaging in science and educating themselves about what we know about the scientific world. So it's sort of, I was mostly speaking about relative to, Shakespeare's era, when, didn't know the laws of thermodynamics yet, right? So.
There's a Gwen at one point writes about the kind of person who reads in general, but especially science fiction and fantasy, and she sort of posits that they are probably also, many of them are probably scientists. She said that there's a similarity in the way in which you devote yourself to thinking out systems and imagining differently, sort of coming up with, the whole process of coming up with a theory of how things work is in some ways like being a writer, and in many cases I think it's probably pretty similar to writing fantasy or science fiction. So I think that those two things actually go together, that it requires similar strengths.
It would be interesting to know if there's fantasy being written by people who come from a background where they don't believe in evolution.
Well, there's Left Behind.
Left Behind, yeah.
Although, but the thing is, interestingly, I wonder whether the authors would say that they were writing fantasy.
Yeah.
So, right. I mean, I do think that there's an impulse to fiction, to fantasy, to imagination in all of us, and that's, that's something that's sort of undeniable, but fantasy as a genre of the genre that we work in.
Okay, I know you've been wanting to ask a question for a while.
It's actually kind of related to this. So I recently actually read that The Half-Made World, and I'm thinking in terms of world building. Is there ever, you have to spend a great deal of time, obviously, in fantasy building the physics engine of your entire world. Is there ever a point where you think, I've gotten into too much detail, or is there ever a point where you're spending so much time working on the world itself as opposed to the characters? I guess what I'm saying is the world is so complex sometimes in fantasy. Does that become more of the story sometimes than the characters, or do you need to focus on the balance more? I mean,
does everyone hear that? Should we repeat? Okay, we're good. All right, go ahead.
Yes, that's a huge problem. It's the gigantic info dump about the world that is interesting to you and not interesting to anybody else. To some extent, that's your editor's problem. But yeah, avoiding letting the setting take over entirely, so that you're just writing about meaningless, made-up rules. It's when the made-up rules take over to such an extent that you're actually writing a story about what would happen if this actually non-existent MacGuffin interacting with this non-existent MacGuffin. Well, I mean, who cares?
It's the difference between the pleasure of writing a novel and the pleasure of writing a role-playing
Yes.
campaign, which is also fantastically fun.
I tend to write very fat for the first draft, do the lot of detail about the world, and then pare it back. And somehow the very fact that even though I don't say it, I know how the world works. Somehow the reader, if you thought it through, if you know, the reader somehow knows you know, and it has that feeling of solidity, even if not everything is stated. Because it's often very hard to get characters to do exposition about the world. They don't want to do it.
And there's some people in the way, this lady right in the middle of the back. Yes. No, don't turn around.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about the distinction, if there is one, between magical realism and fantasy? I have a theory that it's that question of whether you actually know how the world works or whether you're not supposed to, but I'd like to hear what you think.
The distinction between magical realism and fantasy, for anyone who didn't hear that.
I actually don't believe in the distinction. I think magical realists are fantasists who are still in the closet. Just don't want to call it fantasy.
They're readers from the closet.
Maybe, I don't know, or critics, I don't know. I'm prepared to admit the distinction if it is shown to me, but I don't know what it is.
I mean, there's a subset of fantasy which is very, 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 very concerned with making sure that all the rules of the fictional world are consistent and are clear and objective. And you know, there's a lot of very, very good books like that, but that is a specific thing, which I think magic realism isn't, and I do agree that
It's
that's
the
not
ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. But I mean, there's a lot of stuff which is clearly, I mean, it gets marketed as fantasy. It's more like fantasy than, it would get marketed as fantasy rather than magic realism, which also doesn't care all that much about perfect consistency of world building. So yeah, exactly. It's
Maybe one thing would be maybe in magic realism, it's just an occasional bit of color in the background, but it doesn't actually play a central role in the story or the characters' lives. I mean, when I think of like 100 Years of Solitude, it's like every once in a while there's some butterflies or something like that, but it's not like that is really shaping the direction of the plot or the characters' lives.
I always think of something like Midnight's Children, which is where it's, I mean, the central conceit of Midnight's Children is that these are basically the X-Men meeting up.
Yeah.
And yet, that probably takes up about sort of 30 pages out of this 700-page book. I mean, but if you had to sum it up in one sentence.
You on the aisle.
I was wondering, what advice would you give to young authors who are looking to write professionally in the field of fantasy and science fiction?
Advice to young authors who are looking to write professionally.
Write. Yeah, just write a lot, write all the time. Write things that people want to read and get them to read them. I mean, that's well, what I mean, aside from professionally, I just mean how to improve as a writer. But if you want to write professionally and make a living at it, you need to learn what people want to read, and you have to discover if that's something that you enjoy writing. Because otherwise, why not just get a job and write whatever the hell you want to write, you know?
I think get a job is probably you will need a job as well, but you read a lot, you write a lot, and you try and sound, you know, the one thing that every writer has is they are going to sound like themselves. You know, you can sound like other people, but you know, you are probably going to offer something that's much more valuable if you do something that nobody else can do. And even if you're doing mashup style thing, you are still doing something the way that you would do it. So you need to define what it is that you want to write about and write about it the way that you would.
Actually, I will add, you know, the one piece of advice, of sort of slightly less obvious advice that I generally can have for most people who are looking to improve as a writer, is to find people whose work you like and critique it. And and when you're looking for people to critique your work, find people who like it. Don't, unfortunately a lot of times it's easier to find critique groups where it's sort of like a quid pro quo, where you don't actually necessarily enjoy the work of the other writers in the group because you're just sort of thrown together. I think that's almost always not valuable, and you end up giving people critique almost that's meant to like make their work something that you would enjoy more, but that's not what they're trying to write. And so I feel like make an end run around that pitfall, and find and giving critique is as valuable a learning process as getting it.
I would agree with all that, and just add the sort of slightly crassly pragmatic thing of just educating yourself a bit about the publishing industry and how it works, because it's complicated and somewhat weird, and the things that you value about your own work. 5 seconds. Yeah, the things you value about your own work may not be the things that publishers are looking for, and that will catch their eye and make them want to buy your work. So you need to learn a little bit about what makes stuff attractive to publishers, and make sure that stuff is in there too, and that you mention it in your query letter. So going to hear agents and editors speak at writers' conferences and things like that, it's really important.
I have no use for advice. The thing about getting a real job as well is also helpful. I got an email from somebody 6 months ago, a young writer asking, saying, I see that you have a job as a lawyer, should I? I'm very concerned about getting a job because I want to be a writer, I want to keep myself pure. I'm paraphrasing this email in a way that is not necessarily fair to him, but at the same time, I thought, I have to do something about this. This is a really bad idea. So yes, I mean, maintain low expectations and keep trying and hoping for the best and sending stuff out, and sooner or later hopefully you end up making the connection that works.
Well, and actually, I mean, the other option is move to LA and write for television. PA, if you feel like you're a good writer and you enjoy writing scripts and you enjoy working collaboratively, you can make a living, but you have to basically live in LA. You can't live in Europe.
And I'm sure the people who do that probably don't think it was that easy to get into.
No. I mean, I don't want all these people. Sorry. No, but I mean, right. But it's there is a huge difference between sort of writing commercially and doing and thinking about it commercially. And many people who think they want to be writers actually want to write and don't want to do it commercially. Don't want to do the business side of writing. And it's good to know that before you make it your own career.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So.
William Gibson says that we live in a science fiction world, so then the reality that we live in is science fiction. So how does it make sense, to go back to the beginning of the conversation, to critique science fiction literature for not being real, because the reality that we have is science fictional?
Okay, I don't think anybody here would probably say that, but maybe you have a response to it, especially since you're a science fiction writer.
I think that we live in a very strange world, and one of the things that I think one of the reasons I respond to almost all fantasy, regardless of sort of style or form, is that fantasy and actually all of the sort of genres are better in allowing different kinds of moments. So humor, absolute horror, mystery. There are all these things that genres which to begin with were there are forms that everybody recognizes in genre, but within those forms there are moments that I think are much better at capturing a sense of wonder, horror, humor, all these things which in more realistic fiction I think writers often have a harder time tackling. They still do it, but I think it's, for some reason, it seems to be much harder to find realistic fiction which accurately represents those moments which feel true to me, that feel as if they represent the world that I live in. But I don't find those flashes in much realistic fiction.
You back there.
Traditionally, and this is not a commentary on modern fantasy, but in traditional fantasy, it seems to me that the most successful fantasy has been focused on telling the epic or the grandiose story. And traditional science fiction that has been successful has been about social commentary. Why do you think this is?
Okay, just in case, because he's around the corner, traditionally, fantasy, not necessarily all fantasy, but traditionally fantasy has been about telling the epic story, and traditionally science fiction has been about social commentary. Why does the panel think that is? Questions are getting a lot harder.
I think it goes back to the Holy Grail thing, that if the Holy Grail is there, it's a fantasy, that there is. But I can think of a lot of fantasy novels which are social, which contain a great deal of social commentary, and vice versa. I think that's, I'm going to have to go away and think about that. I think it's probably accurate, and yet there are lots of points of argument.
Right. I mean, fantasy is a really powerful tool for talking and thinking about psychology. I mean, it's the form in which things that are traditionally trapped inside people's brains get out and run around and take on form as monsters and magical forces and things like that. It's really good for getting at weird things about human psychology. It's a really good tool for that. People are using it for all kinds of things now, more and more. But I actually think that, on some fundamental structural level, fantasy is very well disposed for talking about psychology, individual psychologies, rather than huge mass social phenomena.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of examples, and
would you like some?
I mean, the obvious example that springs to mind I mean, you can't get a more epic or more successful traditional fantasy than Lord of the Rings. That invents traditional epic fantasy, and there's a great deal of social commentary in Lord of the Rings. I mean, Tolkien, the intrusion of industrialization on the Shire, etc., etc. I mean, there's a lot that is self-consciously, explicitly, and importantly to Tolkien, social commentary. It's quite reactionary social commentary in a lot of ways, but it's social commentary.
Okay, I want to thank this amazing panel for coming.